Hey guys, this is Default Cube CG Matter, and what you're about to watch is the video course I made free on YouTube that's about 2 hours long, talking about procedural nodes and how to make, geometry from displacement and all this. And I just want to say that I literally just took the parts and put them one after another in this nice to watch convenient video, which means that the intros are still going to be there and the outros are still going to be there. So you're going to get like me plugging my Patreon like 4 times, but actually a 5th time because I'm about to do it now. If you enjoy this video course you're about to watch and enjoy this free stuff that I put out on YouTube, do check out my Patreon for some exclusive stuff, or if you want to support me, whatever. I think that's all I have to say. Anyways, enjoy the course. It's a good one. You're going to learn a lot. Hey guys, welcome back to another Default Cube CG Matter tutorial, and the first thing you're probably thinking before we even get into this is, why are you in a dark room? And to be honest with you, I have no idea. It's just very late at night, and I thought, you know what, let my voice carry you through this tutorial. Don't need to focus on my beautiful face. What we want to kind of focus on, rather, is just everything I'm showing you here in Blender. So, what is it that I'm going to show you how to make? Well, it looks like I'm showing you how to make a cone, which is kind of like a stupid tutorial. It's very simple to model, fairly simple to shade, but there is a twist. There is a reason I'm making this not only a tutorial, but a tutorial series, and that is that this cone is actually just a plane. I know, crazy stuff, and some of you might have no idea what I'm talking about. How is the cone actually a plane? What's actually going on here is we have a single plane, and all this geometry, all this shading, everything you're looking at is actually derived from this node network, which I can make full screen. It's derived from this node network, and if you haven't seen this before, it can look like black magic. It's like, oh, how do you, first of all, even deform the geometry, and second of all, how do you make something complicated with it? Well, that's what we're going to be talking about today, I guess, and it's kind of like a useless art in some sense. It's like, why wouldn't you just want to model the cone? In this case, it is kind of useless. There are advantages, like, for example, I could change certain aspects of this, like the cone radius. So here I'm making it a very thin cone, and it kind of breaks the geometry a bit, but you just need more divisions. So I can change something like that. I can distort the stripes on it. I could change a lot of aspects of this, and that's one benefit of this, what is called the procedural workflow, where we can control everything at any time. Nothing's baked in. That's one advantage, but the other advantage is that just knowing how to do this will help you out with a bunch of different projects, right? So this thing is rather useless, right? Making a cone out of nodes, but what you're going to learn here will apply to things that are actually useful. So generally, the cone is actually a fairly simple example. Once you know what you're doing, you're like, oh, a cone's actually not that bad, and that's why I picked it. But if you haven't touched nodes before, I can imagine this will not feel very simple at all. It kind of feels like an advanced topic, so I'm going to try to break this down in a beginner fashion, and I think I've gone over enough intro. So basic idea is we're going to make a cone procedurally out of shader nodes, and I'm going to try to explain it as slowly as possible. So this is the Blender scene I'm going to start off with. Probably you're going to start off with the same one. I'm using Blender version 2.9, I believe. Yes, the 2.9 alpha, which now might be in beta, I don't know. Older versions of Blender work. Newer versions, if you're watching this in the future, of Blender will also work. Do not worry about this. The only thing that matters is we need to be in cycles. And this is actually super important because the main idea, one of the main ideas of making this cone is going to be displacement, taking a plane and deforming it. And this only works in shading if you're in cycles. It does not work in Eevee. So cycles, and then just pick whatever settings you want beyond that. So I'm going to use my GPU. To start off, I'm just going to take this cube and replace it with a plane, since this is what we want to convert into a cone. Technically, you could do it with a cube, but I think this is actually much simpler. I'm also going to turn on experimental mode and add a subdivision surface, which kind of smooths this out, right? If we enable more divisions and all this, which I'm not going to do right now, although we could increase the levels. It will make it smoother. We do want extra divisions, however, we do not want this smoothing, so just click simple, and this will kind of divide it without changing the overall form of it. So again, add a modifier of subdivision surface, set it to simple, and if you have experimental mode enabled, like I do, you're going to have this feature for adaptive, which you want enabled. This basically says, don't subdivide by a certain amount, just subdivide depending on how close it is to the camera. So here it's going to be very subdivided, whereas if I go further away, not so much, because you need less geometry because it's taking up less of the screen. This is just basic setup. Now in the shading workspace, which is where we're going to be spending our time, one more thing we need to do before we can actually get started. So I'm just going to make a new material called cone, and we should probably save this. All of this is just some basic setup. Hopefully it's understandable. We'll call this video cone. The last thing, as I was saying, that you need to take care of is for this material, whatever material you're using to make our cone, make sure you go to the material settings, and under settings, go to displacement and make sure you either have displacement only or even better, displacement and bump. So before it was bump only means that whenever we plug something into the displacement socket, it wouldn't have done anything. So that's why we care. Okay, so how do we start off? What is this first part of making the cone about? Well, I thought an interesting way to divide these videos is by going over different features of the cone. So the first feature of a cone is kind of like the base of it, which is a rounded square. It's basically what is sitting on the cement or on the street or just on the floor in general. So we want to make the base of it, and then we'll work up to the circle and whatever else. So our first goal is making a rounded circle. Sorry, I hope I didn't say that twice, but a rounded square is what I meant. Hopefully I didn't say circle. Either way, our first goal is making a rounded square, which is kind of easy, but we want to make sure it's fully procedural, meaning we can change it on the fly even after the fact. So I guess the first part of making a rounded square is probably just making a square. So I'm going to start off with texture coordinates, and we can either use generated, UV, or object. It's kind of up to you. I prefer something with the origin at the center. So right now object coordinates has that. Alternatively, you could use something like scrolling to UV coordinates. Alternatively, you could use something like UV coordinates and then just displace them by -0.5, and then it will give us something fairly similar to object coordinates. We just need to scale it a bit. But anything with an origin in the center is good in my book. So I recommend object coordinates. Just use those. Okay. So now we have our object coordinates, and I'm going to separate them by x, y, and z. So as we look at x, you can see we have negative x values as we get to 0. And then as we progress up the x-axis, it goes to positive values. With y, it's vertical, and with z, we kind of just don't care. We don't care about this third dimension. Okay? And again, I'm trying to keep this as simple as possible. For those of you who don't understand what's going on, the way I want you to think about this is we're going to look at where our x value is greater than this number, and you can see it's just sweeping from left to right. So really, this is just the x-coordinate of our object where the origin is in the middle. Okay? So now we kind of have x-axis and y-axis, which is a two-dimensional kind of graphing situation. How do we make a square out of this? Well, there's a couple ways. The way I like, which is now the fastest, one of the fastest, used to have to do a bit more because the math node didn't have so many options. But nowadays, we have something called compare. So I'm going to choose compare, and let's compare x. Let's compare x to 0 with some threshold. So I'll explain this in a second. You can see what this node basically does is it creates a stripe vertically that we can control the thickness of. Okay, why is this? Well, it's taking our x value and comparing it to 0. So x compared to 0, and this is our threshold. So we're saying how close is x to 0 within this threshold. If it's very small, then there will be only a very thin slice of values that actually satisfy this condition. If it's very large, then, once we get to 1, it actually fills up the whole thing. So you can kind of think of this as a radius in a kind of very cubic square sense. So again, is x within this threshold of the value? We're just comparing them. We can then duplicate this and do the same thing for our y, which think for yourself what would this look like when we view it. Well, it's going to look horizontal because now we're comparing y values, which makes it look like a horizontal stripe, and we can control it again. So if we want it to be a square, we kind of want to combine these, meaning that, first of all, we should use a value node or something like it to give the side length the same value, because a square has the same horizontal and vertical length. Otherwise, we'd have a rectangle. And then, to combine this region and this region, all we have to do is just add in another math node and set this to multiply. The way you want to think about this is that multiplication means and. So where do we have this and this at the same time? So what's the intersection? Well, it's only at the square, whereas something like addition, add is saying or. which kind of looks like this. Yes, there's a stronger overlap in the middle, but it kind of gives us a cross. So it's the or for and versus and for multiply. Okay, so now we have a square that we can control the radius of. Alternatively, if we had these be independent, we'd have a rectangle, so we could control these axes individually. But we do like the fact that we can control the side length with a single value because it is a square. Okay, so let's say that for now we're going to choose 0.5 as our side length, or I guess it's kind of like half the side length because of the radius thing. Either way, or maybe it is the full thing. It doesn't matter. Either way, think about this as a radius, and I'm just going to give it that name. Okay, so now that we've made our square, the question is how do we round the corners? I mean, the expression that we're using mathematically doesn't really have information about where the corners are, nor would we know how to round them. So let's try to take a different approach. So here's like one algorithm or one idea for how to do it. So imagine we took the square and added a circle at each corner. So one here, one here, one here, and one here. Well, it wouldn't really give us a rounded square because the circles are actually contained inside of here. It's getting us close, like it's putting the corners where we want them with this nice circle, but we still have this kind of sharp corner left over. So we want to do that with the circles, but we also want to cut into the shape first. So imagine that with this corner, we kind of cut away a square, and then we add in a circle. That would give us the nice rounded corner. So that's the idea we're going to go with. So first of all, how do we get rid of squares? How do we delete the corners? And then how do we add in circles? So for deleting the corners, we need to know the coordinates of each of these. Well, let's think about what the coordinates are. We know that the origin is right here. It's in the middle. It has coordinate 0, 0. And we know that this corner is this radius. In this case, it's 0.5 along the x and 0.5 along the y. So in this case, it's 0.5, 0.5. Now it is 0.67, 0.67, and in general, it's value, value. Over here, it's negative value, because we're going to the left, which is negative x, and then down, which is negative y, and then, you could keep going, like this top left is negative value for negative x, and then value, etc. Okay, so we kind of do know the coordinates. They're dependent on this. So let's try to make a square on each of these corners. And we can kind of repeat this node setup, but we just want to shift it up here. So how do we do this? Well, first of all, let's view our object coordinates. If we can take this origin and move it to the corner, and again, we'd have to do this for all four, but if we could take this origin and move it to the corner, that would be super useful, right? That's exactly what we want. Then we'd have the origin centered at where we want all the action to happen. Well, we can do that very simply by adding a vector math node, which is, this is addition of a vector, just translates everything essentially. So here I'm shifting the coordinate system on the x and the y. And we know that we want to translate everything by, at least the x and y, by this value right here. So we could either, this is kind of a tricky situation, you could either plug this in and it will kind of do it. I guess you want to multiply by -1, so now we have the bottom left corner, but it's also manipulating the z coordinate. Because we've said use this value for x, y, and z. We kind of want to ignore that part. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a combine x, y, z node. So instead of putting in our vector manually here, we could connect this and control it outside of the addition. And then we're just going to control x. Let me try that again. X and y. And again, this is the bottom left corner because it's kind of counterintuitive. You'd think that adding 0.5, 0.5 would shift it upwards, but rather it's saying this point was already -0.5, -0.5, and what happens when you add 0.5, 0.5? Well, it bounces out to 0. That's the origin. So it's kind of the opposite of what you'd think. Let me just make the opposite of this scenario. So before these values reach here, what we can do is put a math node in between, set it to multiply by -1, and now it will be up there. Okay. And then we could kind of repeat this node network from before. So let's literally do that. Let's just copy it, Shift D to do that. And now we're going to plug this in instead. So instead of, whoops, I've lost my nodes. I think button, yeah, that there's a couple hotkeys for recovering that. But what I was saying is instead of just bringing these object nodes directly into our square setup, we're bringing in the translated version. That's the idea. Let's get rid of that. Okay. So currently, what is this going to look like? Well, it's going to look like a square that is centered right here with a radius of 0.49.49. And if we add in a value node, just like before, now it's a radius of a square centered there, we can now control this. Okay? So if we want to have this cut away from our original square, it's kind of obvious what we need to do. We take this square and subtract this square, right? We want to get rid of it. So how do we do that? We just take another math node, set it to subtract, and we want to subtract, we start off with this, and we want to subtract this away. So we'll just do that right here. And now you can see we've made a square with the corner kind of cut off, and we can control kind of the radius of that cutoff. Okay, cool. One more technical thing to think about before we kind of do this for all four or the three remaining corners is technically some of the square, especially the area up here, is kind of hanging off an area where there is no square here. Basically what I'm trying to say is when we subtract, we kind of get rid of the intersection, but some of this extra stuff over here is not just 0, but it's negative, because we took 0 and subtracted some of the remainder of the square. A nice way to visualize this is with a greater than node. So you can see this looks exactly the same, but if we go into the negative territory, we kind of have this hidden thing right here, which, you know, we don't see because anything below 0 is just kind of set to black, but could mess up our displacement in the future. So to fix that, just enable clamp, and that will make sure that anything below 0 just gets sent to 0, right? It clamps it between 0 and 1. And now if we do a greater than and go under 0, it will just give us, you know, everything. It will give us white because everything is bigger than a negative value currently because of clamping. Okay, so now the question is, do we need to kind of just, duplicate this and then each time use a different vector over here to get all the corners? That would be one way to do it, but not only would it be pretty computationally expensive because you'd be adding a lot of nodes, but it'd be messy and it would take a lot of time. So let me go over a trick that will help you quite a bit. So here's the coordinate system that we're using to, you know, do the thing. Really what we want to do is do the same trick for this corner and for this corner and for this corner. And a nice way to do that is notice that anything that isn't this top right area has the issue of being negative in some sense. So this black area is negative in x and negative in y. This area is negative in x. This area is negative in y. Basically what I'm saying is if we can somehow convert these areas to being entirely positive, then we'd have the exact same thing going on as this quadrant over here. And there's a name for this idea, and the name is absolute value. So vector math node, we set it to absolute value, if I can find it, absolute. And I will be honest with you. I mean, we could logic it out, but I do always forget where it should be placed. So let's try to put it ahead. So that doesn't seem to really do what we want, right? We want this black dot not only here, but in the other three corners. So it's definitely not that. And I'm thinking that what we need to do is put this probably before. So let's try that. There you go. You know, if you think this out, it probably made sense, you know, before trying it back and forth and all this. But the reason that this works is originally we have our object coordinates where, again, we have this quadrant idea where this is a positive quadrant and the other three have negative, you know, components to them. If we take an absolute value, then they're all positive. And then when we shift them, it's kind of doing the thing everywhere. Okay, if you don't understand that, don't worry. Basically, the trick is absolute value gives us a nice four-way mirroring, kind of like a symmetry. And then if we view our squares, now we have them in all four quadrants. And really in all four corners, that's the thing. And we can control the radius, which means we're subtracting away this entire thing, which gives us this. So we've kind of made a procedural cross-generation. And you can see that now if we can somehow add in circles, like here and here, then it will look like we have rounded corners. Not really, we're just kind of taking a square, subtracting away squares, and then adding circles, but visually it does do exactly that. Okay, so how do we do that? Well, we already know that we want to use this trick, this absolute value trick, to put a circle not only in this top right quadrant, but in the other four. So if we can focus on making a circle in the top right quadrant, all the rest of the work is already going to be done for us. So I say that we take our coordinate system here, this absolute value and shifted coordinate system, which looks like this, and let's use it to make a circle. There's a bunch of ways to do this. The easiest way, in my opinion, is using the length function, which when you input in vectors, because that's what this is, it outputs the size or magnitude or length of those vectors. And here's what it looks like. You can kind of see how this might already give us 4 circles. Basically, think about it as, let's only focus on the top right quadrant for now. So right here is where one of the origins were that we've kind of manipulated to be there. That's going to have a length of 0 because the vector is 0, 0, 0. Length of that is 0. And then as we go radially outward from that origin, it's going to give us a nice radial gradient, meaning we're kind of just mapping the radius in each of these quadrants, right? Because we did the mirror trick. If we muted this, then it would just look like that. And if we muted this, it would be in the center, is the idea. So let's unmute. So now to make this look like, circles, we could either, okay, there's 2 methods. You could either use a color ramp node, and I feel like this is a kind of short-sighted way of doing it, so you make this kind of crisp fall off. It works. However, not only is it very imprecise, because you're just kind of dragging handles, but we don't just want any circles, we want circles with the exact correct radius. Otherwise, when we put the circles on top of this, there will be some, we'll get the nice overlap, but we're going to get some areas of the circle that are outside of where we want, right? So our radius is already chosen for us. So how do we do this? Well, we can use a math node, since we've converted these vectors into values, because the length is just a number, it's not 3-dimensional. And we're going to use something like either greater than or less than. So greater than is going to say, where is the radius bigger than, in this case 0.5, and then we can manipulate that. And notice that the circles are black because anywhere in the interior has a radius smaller than this. And the radius, as you go inwards, it gets smaller and smaller and smaller. So obviously it's going to be smaller than 0.29 in this case. That's one way to do it. I'm going to use less than, which is just the inverse. It doesn't matter. You could have just done this and then use a invert node or something like it. Whatever you want. We're going to use less than. So less than. And again, we don't just want any value. And let me illustrate why. I've already explained it, but let me illustrate. So we want to take this and add our circles back in, which are already centered on the corners because of our nice setup from before. So let's just add, because we want this or this. And you can see, and again, make sure you have clamping, otherwise you're going to have some areas that have a value of 2 because we're taking a region with 1 and a region with 1 and adding them, which gives us 2. So just clamp that to make it uniform. You can see that these circles are way too big, and you could just kind of guess what the radius should be. Oh, by the way, we do need to shift them down. I did forget that. Maybe we should take care of that first, but either way, you do see the argument. The radius, in this case, is too big, and we'd kind of have to manipulate it to be just right. So let's take care of that shifting that I forgot to consider. So right now, these circles are centered where? They're centered at the corners of our original square. That's close to what we want, but instead we want them centered at kind of where, kind of the corner of where we cut it off, which is determined, remember, by this radius of these squares, right? This determines where the corners are. So we want this corner, etc. Well, I feel like it should be pretty obvious that all we need to do is manipulate our input coordinates. So I'm just going to duplicate these and feed this into what we had before, like this. And let's do that. So now we have 2 different variations. Let me get rid of that. I'm having trouble selecting this. We have one variation of our coordinate system, the absolute value in addition, going to our squares, and we have another variation of absolute value in addition going to our circles. So let's do what we had before. We're using the same vector that uses these, x and y values that we already explained why we're using. So currently this should give us the exact same thing as before, which almost gives us what we want, but again, the circles are in the wrong place, which is visible when we do this. So all we need to do is we need to manipulate what vector we're putting in here so it shifts correctly. So I'm going to do it by putting in another vector add node. I know it's getting messy right here. And you can see that we can kind of just manipulate these values until it's right. And here you can see why this actually looks like a rounded square. once we get the positions right. But how do we get this exactly without guessing? Well, all we have to do is use another combine x, y, z, and this time instead of using x and y from our square radius, we'll use it from our corner squares. I'll clean this up in a bit because it is getting crazy. So same as before, x, y, okay, which gives us what we want. However, again, these circles aren't big enough, and they should imagine that they're centered here. They're centered, it's getting confusing. They're centered at the corner of this of this cutout. This is where they're centered. Well, how big should they be? They should have a radius of this length, right? And that would give us a nice perfect circle. Well, we actually already know this value, and that is this one. So 0.08. 0.08. So we take this, we plug it in here, we view it, and it's beautiful. It's beautiful. And you might be thinking, okay, that was a lot of work. I could have just moved stuff manually and eyeballed it until it made sense. Well, look at it this way. Look at it this way. We have two parameters. One of them is the radius, and I guess I should specify. We'll call this main radius. Or maybe we should just call it side length, really, because it's referring to the original square. And we'll call this one rounding, because it's referring to the radius of our circles, and it also positions them in the correct spot, which looks like rounding. So here's what I want you to consider. We have one slider that changes the side length, and the circles, notice, are staying in the correct spot, and the rounding works as well. If we make our rounding big enough, it will look like a circle, and if we make it small enough, it will look like a square. And all of this works together. You could have made these independent from each other, this one and this one, so you can get a rounded rectangle instead of a square, but in this case, we have a much simpler situation. And remember, we kind of got lost in the weeds here. Remember, the idea here is we wanted to make a nice procedural base for our cone. So a cone kind of looks something like, it doesn't have this much rounding, more like something like this, and with our, our generator, it's basically a generator. With our generator for rounded squares, we can now create any base for a cone that we want. And let me just give you a sneak peek about what we can do with this. First of all, let's do a bit of cleanup. Don't worry about the fact that this is a mess, because honestly, we never need to touch any of this. The only things we care about are these red things, these inputs, because that's what we'd be manipulating. So just drag everything that isn't red into a clump. And then you could either, select all and then Control G, which puts them in a nice node group. And that's probably the better way to do it. Or you could just hit Shift P to put them in a frame. I'm going to go with Control G to put them in a node group, which we can move closer. So now it's, it's still the same thing going on, but it's a lot simpler. And we can always control using these, or alternatively, you could just use this stuff built right into the node. But I think for simplicity's sake, we'll just keep the same setup from before. Okay, so I want to show you one more thing before we wrap up part one, which I feel like was pretty intense. But again, it's hard to explain this stuff at a beginner level because it's very mathematical. But remember, we set up all our displacement stuff. Let's actually see what this looks like with displacement. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to view this with a diffuse BSDF. And for our displacement, we're just going to use a displacement node, hook that up, and then, by the way, set mid-level to 0 so it's not like offset at all. What should our height be for our displacement? I'll give you a hint. This is our height, meaning black is 0, meaning a height of 0, don't change it, and 1, or white, is a height of 1. So we can just put that here. And let's view it with our diffuse BSDF. Okay, so a couple things. First of all, it looks a bit glitchy, especially in the corners, and this is just because it's procedural, meaning that the amount of detail that we're going to see, how smooth this corner is going to be, is directly dependent on how much geometry we have. So if we take our dicing scale and make it smaller, you can see this gets nice and rounder. You could go down to 0.2. This is going to become more and more computationally expensive as you continue, but you kind of just want to set this to a very small number on render. For now, we're just viewing it. And the second thing is that the effect of this is very large, right? A cone isn't this tall, the base of it. We can either control this with the scale to make it smaller, but that's not really what we want because We'd rather keep this at 1 since we're going to be feeding more than just this into our height. So we want to keep this normalized. So what I recommend is just using something like a math node and then just multiplying it before it even reaches height. So that's one way to do it. And let's actually change our lighting to an HDRI just so we can see what's going on a bit better. So I'm just going to use a free HDRI that I have from like HDRI Haven or something. Something with a bit of contrast. I like that. And let's hide that with film transparent. Okay. So again, we can return to our nodes, which I always lose. We want to make this even, not as tall. And if anything, you could just make a value node. So right now it's like 0.13. And then connect this, and now we actually have another parameter for the height of our cone. So you can see how all of this is building very procedurally. So let me call this base height, just like that. Okay, and again, to make this smoother, we just bring this down, and I think this level also helps, but again, it will make everything a bit slower. So I just recommend making it very smooth on render time. And by the way, for you experts out there who want a good way to solve this without just increasing the resolution, or decreasing dicing scale, which increases the resolution, a good solution is instead of having a very harsh map that goes from, let me view this from the top and remove displacement, that goes from black to white immediately. If you could have a bit of a gradient, a bit of a fall off, there will be a nice transition for the geometry to catch up with the boundary. So hopefully professionals, experts know what I'm talking about right there. That's just an advanced solution. But for now, this is actually fine. And if you look at a cone, the base of a cone, it is pretty straight. There's a bit of curvature, but this is at least a reasonable approximation. So I think this is a good place to leave off this part of making the cone. Thank you for watching part 1 of this advanced procedural stuff. I just wanted to end off with this before I actually end the video. If you want to support this channel and everything I do, and you like these tutorials, and you want to get benefits, the best way to do that is via my Patreon. You're going to get exclusive video tutorials if you get a certain tier. You can get project files, you can get a whole bunch of other stuff. But in general, it's just a very, very nice way to support me and these tutorials if that's something you want to do. And yeah, Patreon promotion at the very end. I'm serious about it. It is the only reason I can do YouTube full time. So thank you everybody who wants to do that. Enjoy part 2 when it comes out. There might be a day or 2 delay. Part 2 of PRO-CEDURAL. Does that mean it's twice as hard as part 1 or only +1 harder than part 1? Does it mean that this intro is going to be twice as long? Yeah, either way, welcome back everybody, back to the darkness where we are going to continue working on our completely procedural cone. So where did we leave off on part 1? Well, we kind of made this, let me get rid of the displacement, we made this kind of rounded, I mean not kind of, we did make this rounded rectangle, which we can control many aspects of procedurally, like the rounding, how round this is, so we could have like sharp corners or something else. We have the side length, which is just 1 parameter instead of 2 because it's a square, not a rectangle. So 1 side length describes both of them because they're the same. And then I guess if we put our displacement back and view this BSDF, which actually gives us nice displacement, we also made a parameter for the height of this, which is really just what we're multiplying. And I know it's playing very slowly, or it's actually rendering very slowly. And that's par for the course with displacement. But what was I saying? I was saying that this base height is basically what we're multiplying by before it reaches displacement. So it's just kind of like a scaling before it reaches here. Okay, so what do I want to talk about today? We've already covered quite a bit. Well, I think that the next step should be we've made the base of the cone. Let's make the actual part of the cone, which is actually just the rest of the geometry, right? Once you have the base and the cone, everything else is just coloring, like the stripes and the orange and the dirt. So yeah, that's the game plan. I guess let's just do it. And you might think, oh, do we need to make another giant node group like this and then just package it up? Not really. I mean, if you think about it, what do we need to do? We need to make a cone, which is kind of like a circular thing that goes upwards. And as we've already made circles before for these corners, we kind of already know how to approach this. So I guess let's just do that. So I'm going to start off with the same object coordinates as before. And by the way, while we're making this, it might be helpful to disable displacement just for now, just so we can see what we're doing very nicely. Okay. So what do we have? We have our object coordinates, and we want to make a circle. I already showed you the trick for this, and that is using a vector math node and setting it to length, which again works because, let me view this, it works because what it does is it takes the input vector and outputs the length, the magnitude, the size of that vector, where the origin being the center, this black area right here, that is the vector 0, 0, 0, which means it has a magnitude, a length, the size of 0. And as you go radially outward from the origin, it gives us this spherical. Technically, it's spherical, not a circular or radial, because it does work in 3 dimensions. But whatever, it gives us a nice spherical gradient, which is exactly what we need to make a circle. So right now, let's say that we took this and incorporated it into our displacement. What would happen? Well, let me just set this up and view this. Well, how would we incorporate it in the first place? Well, we know that we need to do this incorporation. Keep saying that over and over and over again. We need to do that before it reaches this height, because once we get to this displacement node, everything's final. So what we can do is we can add in a math node set to add, since we want to take this, and not in the sense of intersection, but or. Again, add is or, multiplies and. So we're just going to add this and this. And you can see that it kind of incorporates both of them. We still have our base, kind of, but it's using this radial kind of gradient to make something super strange. So it is incorporating both of them, just not necessarily in the way we want. And that's because this isn't really like a circle in the area that we want. We want to, first of all, invert it, because you saw that the displacement was highest at the boundaries. Let me just show you again. Highest at the boundaries and lowest in the center. Okay, so there's a couple ways to fix this. You could either try like an inversion, which is just kind of like the naive approach, I like to call it. So we connect that to color. So this is what inverted looks like. So I keep having to get rid of a displacement, but you can see this is inverted and this is not inverted. So it does give us the highest value, the biggest height in the center, which is what we want, but I'm actually going to use something a bit more sophisticated. Get ready for a new node, everybody. RGB curves, oh yes. When we just add this normally, it's not really going to do anything. So this is without and this is with. It doesn't do anything. However, let's just connect this here and view what this gives us with our BSDF. So you can see this gives us the same thing, but however, let me finish that sentence now. We can do the inversion using this RGB curves instead of the invert node, which you might be thinking, that kind of seems harder, and it is, but there's a reason for it. So to invert, we say when x, or really not x, when this input is equal to 0, it has a height of 0, so we can actually just map it to 1, which is the inverse. And then when it's 1, we map it to 0. So we kind of just flipped it. So you can see how we kind of now have the opposite kind of thing going on. And something that you might notice is some of the displacement is actually negative, like it goes below the floor plane. And that indicates, and that's fine, right? But that indicates that this output, what's being outputted from here, is not clamped, right? There are values smaller than 0, which in this case is not what we want, because we don't want anything going under our base. That was a gnarly voice crack. So how do we get clamping going on? The trick I like to use is I like to use a math node set to add with 0, so that we just take this. And then basically what's happening here is RGB curves is being added 0. In other words, nothing's happening. But if we enable clamp, then this just kind of works like a clamp node. So without and with. Just make sure that there's no negative displacement. Okay, that's useful. However, you can still see that, this circle is kind of going wider than our base. And that's why we're getting this weird shape. So if we could somehow scale what's going on, then that would work. Of course, there's a couple ways to do this. We could either manipulate what's being sent into here. So we could, let's get rid of the clamping. We could just multiply. And then this basically manipulates like the radius of our circle. So you can see now it barely, but at least kind of looks like a cone. I wouldn't recommend this, because the reason why I added this RGB curves is because we can do everything we need and more inside this node. So to fix this, what we're going to do is, I think it's this one, if we think about it. We want the area where the radius is 0 to happen way before it goes out here, right? So we kind of want to scrunch it in, so therefore we just, if I can click it, we just drag this inwards. So you can see what this is doing. It's just making our cone a bit smaller in the same sense that our math trick before was. So now you can just slide this to where you want. Now I think a cone is something like this. We'll see. Something like that. And, of course, the next issue is that a cone doesn't have a pointy tip. But what if I told you that we could literally just draw what this looks like? So here's like a, a fat boy egg cone. You can also cut inwards and make a bunch of weird designs. This is the idea. And basically what we're doing here, as I've already made a video about this, we're kind of graphing using our radius as an input, our length as an input. So as it goes outwards, we're going along this RGB curve. So when radius is 0, meaning it's at the center of the base, it starts up here with the highest height, so that's why it has that tip. And as we go radially outward, it's going to go diagonally down to 0, so that's why it cuts off. And you can see how it's kind of obvious if you kind of look at the profile. So you see this curve is the same as this curve. Okay, so all of that being said, how do we flatten the top? Well, I'm just going to add a node right here, and then also set this to vector handle, which is going to give us a nice sharp, no smoothing kind of thing. And we're going to set this all the way to 1. So basically, any values between here and here are just going to be maximum. And then we just need to drag this in. So it doesn't happen that late, but just pretty early. And you can see how this kind of gives us something somewhat cone-like, right? It has a flat top. So why does this look horrible still? I think it's because it's not tall enough. And we could either, fix this by manipulating the base with our parameters, but assuming we want to keep this the same, let's instead manipulate the cone. So remember, everything we did over here, we multiplied, we scaled before it even reached our displacement. We can do the same thing over here. So let's just multiply. No need to clamp since we've already clamped before. So we're going to multiply. And then if this is set to 1, we're getting the same thing as before because we just pipe everything in and multiply by 1 and then everything happens the same. But if we pick values bigger than 1, like, I don't know, this, it gets taller and taller and taller. So the idea is we need to find the correct height. And you might think, oh, this would be a pretty useful slider. That was a horrible sentence. This would be a pretty useful slider, and you'd be right. So we're going to make that another value to add to our collection of parameters right here. So we can call this one cone height instead of base height. I'm slurring my words today. Cone height. And then we can just control it from here. And note that this only affects the general magnitude of the displacement of this part. It doesn't really do anything about this flattening. And unfortunately, we can't do something with a value node and connect it into this thing. That's not a thing. We could have done this more mathematically without RGB curves, but whatever. At least for now, you can still control this procedurally using this node. It's just not as nice as having a value node, but that's fine. So just find the correct height, whatever you think is correct. That looks pretty good. I'd say that it'd be better if this was a bit wider. So how do we control the width? Well, again, we can do it from here. So let's just have it go a bit more outward so it's getting closer to the edge. And that kind of looks like a cone. Kind of. So I guess there's still two things to do. Of course, by the way, just a little tip. If you want to get some nice, I don't know, what's it called, curvature, so it's not just base and then cone, you don't want this sharpness, what you can do is kind of draw a nice bend, so it kind of bends into it. I'm not going to do it because it's hard to get the shape right, so here you can see we have a more bendy cone than what we had before. Maybe we should just add a tiny, tiny bit of bend. There you go. I think that's nice and tasteful. But you can do that. What was I saying? I was saying that there's two things we need to do to complete the geometry of this cone. So again, I don't care about what it looks like in terms of color, reflectivity, specular, blah, 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 blah. Not right now. What we care about is the general form. Well, there's two issues. First of all, we don't necessarily want this plane here. So everything that's not the cone. We could either turn this into a street, which is something I hadn't considered, but that is something we could do, but I don't want to go over procedural cement or whatever in this tutorial. So our other option, which is what I'm going to go for, is we're going to make it invisible. So again, if you're thinking, how do I get rid of everything except the cone? You might have thought, oh, I need to shrink this inwards towards the center. Doesn't need to be that complicated. We can just literally make it transparent. And that's the trick a lot of people use. So let's go with that first. So basically, the surface properties are defined by this BSDF. Well, let's also add in a transparent BSDF. So if we use the transparent BSDF, it's going to be transparent everywhere. Still going to have the geometry, we just can't see it. If we do this, it's going to give us this, so we somehow need to mix these together, right? So we mix them together, but we don't want it, 50% this and 50% this everywhere, where we can control the influence of each using the factor. We don't want that. In fact, what we want is 100% influence of our transparency here, and then 0 in our cone. Well, how do we, create this factor mask? Well, what if I told you that we already made it? Well, think about it. So imagine we look at this from the top. We want transparency everywhere outside of this rounded rectangle. Yes, we do want no transparency in the circle, but that's enclosed by this rounded rectangle. In other words, I'm saying this mask that we made, which kind of looks weird right now, but that's just because of the displacement. Imagine it looked better. Everything outside of this, we want it to be transparent. So why don't we just use this as the factor? And not really the multiplied version, but in fact this version that we haven't scaled. So let's use this right here as our factor. And you're going to notice it almost gets us there, but it's inverted, right? It is definitely inverted. So what we can do is we can either, drop in and invert before it even reaches the factor. But what I prefer is just switching these two inputs. Okay. So now we have something close. It's the right idea, but you can see some of our bases being cut into, and you're thinking, oh, the logic of what you said made sense. I don't know why this would happen. This is just an issue of geometry, and in fact, the more geometry you have, the more accurate. Now you can see we have some of these chunks that weren't here before. The more accurate you can get this, but really what's happening is that this mask that we made from the top view, just imagine it looked normal, or you know what, let me just show you. This mask that we made is kind of like infinitely sharp, meaning that the boundaries just goes from 0 to 1 immediately. There's no fall off. And that means that when we, displace, some vertices are going to fall here, some of them here, but no matter what, it's going to either be displaced or not. There's no gradual fall off for stuff to happen, meaning that, once I view this, it's going to look very choppy. So some of these vertices make the cut, some of them don't and fall into transparency. The only way we can fix this with what we have currently is adding more divisions, but I don't want to do this. So is there a smarter solution? There is. What if instead of using this mask from before, we use the same thing, but just a bit bigger? Just give it a bit of buffer room. We don't have a gradient, but we can do something almost as good, which is giving a bit of a margin or buffer. Well, yeah, we can do that. So let me just duplicate this and put in the same inputs. So for our texture coordinates, use this. For our rounding, use this. And for our side length, use this. So this node and this node are currently identical. But the only difference I want between, let me just get rid of this. The only difference I want between this one and this one is that this one should just be a tiny bit bigger. Well, how do we do that? Well, we do have this nice side length that will make it a bit bigger. Of course, we can't manipulate it here because that will affect both of these. It's connected to both. We can make that a bit clearer. So these are all connected to both. But if we have the side length be manipulated by a math node before it even reaches, then we've now kind of made this path and this path independent. So if we add 0, nothing happens. But if we add something like 0.01, let me just zoom in here so you can see. If we add something like 0.01, it will become just a bit thicker, or a bit, bigger, but still have the same general shape. And now we want to use this, the modified version. So here's the small one, here's the big one. Whoops. Here's the small one, here's the big one. We want to use the big one as our factor. So let's see what that looks like. Okay, we need to include our displacement. Okay, so now you can see that we're almost there. In fact, we got a lot more of our geometry. And if you're thinking to yourself, the bigger the margin, the more room we have to play with, and therefore the more correct this is going to look. If that's what you're thinking, then you're correct. So instead of 0.01, we can make it like 0.02. And now you see we're getting just a bit more geometry. Let's try 0.03. And again, you could just add more divisions to also help this, but this is a nice solution. Okay, so I'm going to go with 0.05, and that seems to do it. Of course, the sacrifice is we do have some of this over here. Some of this boundary is, the floor, and we don't want that because, again, we just want the cone. But, this is the best you can do. And in fact, when we're viewing this in the viewport, our subdivisions aren't actually as dense or as high as they'd be during render. So even if it doesn't look that good on 0.02, right here, it might look, perfect on render. So at least for viewing, we can keep it at 0.05. But when it's time for render, we can make this margin a bit smaller, lose a bit of the floor, and still get good results. Okay, so that was a long tangent about how to get rid of the floor. We did it with transparency, kind of a clever solution. But now the other thing that's missing is the cone is kind of supposed to go inwards a bit. It's not like this solid thing at the top. It punches inward. In other words, we need to make a circle that we subtract. In terms of displacement, we subtract, so it goes inwards. Well, how do we make a circle? We already know this. We actually just did it. And some of the work is already done for us with this length node, which we should view from the top. Now, in fact, it's going to look a bit strange because of the displacement, so let's get rid of it. So, same length setup as before. Well, how do we, how do we make a circle? Well, we don't want to do this kind of like fall off type stuff with the RGB curves. We would rather just make it a nice sharp circle, and as we've talked about before with the rounding rectangles, in other words, part 1, we can use a math node, set it to, I think, less than is what we decided, and then we can control the radius. In fact, this just means what area is going to be punched into, and you better believe this deserves its own value. So let's call this punchin'. I'm punching him. Fallen to the floor. He can't stand me anymore. My rap battle, more like rap galore. Okay, so where are we? Punchin' is going to control the radius. Well, what do we want to do with this? Well, we want to use it to subtract before the displacement happens, right? Because that's saying instead of displacing upwards, displace downwards. So let's see what this looks like. Okay, so here's our cone. What we're going to do is, we did our whole calculation. One of these is the base, and one of these is the cone part. Both of them are scaled. And then we are going to subtract our circle that we just made and put that in there. Okay, what does this look like? You can see that it kind of gives us the right idea. In fact, it gives us a fairly interesting shape. But if there's one problem with this, it's that the radius is too big. So if we make it like 0.1, now we're getting closer, but in fact it needs to be smaller than, the flat area up top. So we just keep bringing it down, something like that. So you can see what this is doing, maybe a bit bigger, 0.06, whatever. We have a parameter for this is the point. So now we have something that punches in, but notice that this less than is kind of like a very discrete, either true or false kind of thing, meaning it's either completely black or completely white, which for the 1000th time we can't see when we have displacement. It's very harsh, which means that it's going to be in this area where it's subtracting and we're punching inwards. It's going to go all the way down so we can actually see it over here. This is like at floor level, at least it should be. We don't want it to go that low. We want to be able to kind of see it, so maybe it's only going in a couple inches instead of a foot. How do we do that? Well, we're subtracting it, but by how much? Well, by something that we scale by. So multiply, same trick over and over. So 1 gives us the same thing as before. 0 gives us no subtraction, right? So we get the flat top. Let's experiment. So 0.1 punches just a bit inwards, maybe not far enough. Let's do 0.2. I think I'm happy with that. And for those of you saying that I don't know the anatomy of a cone, I really don't know what it's supposed to look like, but at least the idea is nice. So let's say that that's fine. Now for this one, yes, we could add a value. I think we will. I don't really intend to use this because I think 0.2 is a good amount, but if we were to make our cone, let me bring this over. If we were to make our cone super tall, so what is that? That's cone height. If we were going to make this super tall, I would like the punch-in to go a lot further than just 0.2, is the idea. So now, let's see what controls we have. And again, I just want to emphasize that this floor thing is not that big of a deal. And in fact, I don't know why I didn't think about it, we should add a bit of a margin slider. So 0.05, connect this, call it margin. Okay. and now we have a control over this. So this should be smaller than it is on render because we have a bit more buffer room because the divisions are actually happening. What I meant before with the divisions are like denser on render. So you can see right now we want a fifth of a pixel dicing scale, so 0.2. And that's what's going to happen when we hit render, but right now it's previewing at 1.6. So it's like, you know, what is that? That's 7 times? No, 8 times. I can't do math. This is 8 times less divided than it's going to be on render. So, you know, it's going to be fine. What was I saying? I was saying that we can control the cone height. So how tall this thing is, and we can make some interesting cones using this. We have the rounding, which you don't want to make too big, but we can have a nice square cone. And notice that since this affects both of these, you know, both the normal one and the one we're using for transparency, it's just going to work the way you'd expect. So we have rounding, we have mystery value that I didn't give a name. What is this? This is the punch-in strength. In other words, how deep down will that hole at the top we made go? So when it's set to 0, it's going to be a flat top, and we already talked about it. We have side length, which is just the size of the thing. So again, if you don't want to make it smaller than it's supposed to be, so smaller than the cone radius. Yes, we could have made this mathematically handle itself. So even if we do a value too small, we'll still give a good result. But for now, we're not going to do that. So that's side length. Base height is just how tall this cone is, which again, you need more geometry for. It's going to break. But going downwards shouldn't be a big deal. Yeah. We have our punch-in and our margin. And I think, unless I'm forgetting something, I think we've done our geometry very nicely. I think this is a good place to end. There's one more thing I want to do, but I think it might be stretching it for this tutorial. I think you've already learned enough. So let's just do a bit of cleanup, I guess. So since we have everything we kind of need exposed here, we can turn this whole mess into just kind of like a group node. Now, of course, there is the issue of that RGB curves, which you want to control, but if it's in a group node, you can't really. I'm just going to say that for now, we're happy with it. We can always play with it later. But for now, I'm just going to keep this because I think this is going to be useful in the future. But all of this, I think, yes, I think all of this we can group together. So that's Control G, and now we've cleaned it up just a bit. Now, of course, I didn't group it in a way that makes complete sense, but that's for you to take care of. I'm not going to take care of it for you. Okay, cool. I think that's the end of part 2. So there you go. Thank you guys for watching part 2 of PRO-CEDURAL. You've made it to the end, and there's still more to go, probably episode 3 and 4. I don't think we're going to make it past 4, but we'll see. Again, this is that end of episode Patreon plug. Please listen. I do have something to say. If you want to support this channel and you like the tutorials I make and you want benefits, the best way to support me, Default Cube CG Matter, is via the Patreon. There are different tiers. Some of them give you video courses, which are exclusive tutorials that you'd otherwise need to pay for on Gumroad. Some of the tiers give you Discord access, behind-the-scenes tutorial files, which is very relevant for this one. But regardless of all that, this is the best way to keep me floating and making tutorials consistently. Because I feel like I fill in a nice gap where not many people talk about this aspect of nodes in this case. But yeah, that's my end of show plug. Check out my Patreon if this is something you're interested in. I would greatly appreciate it. But you're also getting something for your money besides just feeling good. There you go. That's my pitch. See you guys. Welcome back, everybody, to part 3 of PRO-CEDURAL. Is it 50% harder than part 2 or 3 times harder than part 1? I don't know. Either way, we're back. One tiny note before we continue on to the nodes, and I guess I should just mention this. Clearly, I'm in a new place. I mean, it's no longer dark or anything, but I moved, meaning that there's going to be some echo for now, because I don't have a rug, I don't have curtains, there's nothing to absorb sound, so this mic might get some reverb, but maybe that makes my voice sound better. I don't know. This doesn't really matter. Okay, so we're back in PRO-CEDURAL, the scene that we left off with. What did we do? Well, we made all our geometry, again, using displacement maps. So we created our cone mask, we created our rounded square, and then the rounded square with margin, just to solve that issue of clipping. which again, we can make the margins smaller if we were to render, because then we actually get more subdivisions. Because here we're only previewing 1.6 pixels, here 0.2. We already talked about all this. So let's apply our displacement. This is where we left off. We have all our geometry, and now the question is, it has the shape of the cone, but how do we make it look like a cone? And the answer is, it's pretty much the color of the surface, how reflective it is. Controlling stuff like this is what makes it look like a cone. So for example, if we were to take our diffuse BSDF, which is what you're seeing, notice that, again, this is a plane, meaning that there should be geometry here, and there is, but we just made it transparent. So again, this is what it's supposed to look like, but we just did a bit of a trick to get rid of it. But yes, we're viewing the diffuse BSDF, so if we were to change the color, we can make it look more cone-like. But before we get into stuff like that, you might notice, or you might know, that most cones have stripes. And that's the thing I want to talk about now. So we could make the whole thing orange, but at least cones in the US, they have a stripe here. Usually they even have 2 stripes. So we need to make a mask for where we want stripes and where we want not stripes. So where do we want white and where do we want orange, basically? So I guess we're doing one more tutorial about mask creation, which is pretty much the whole idea behind procedural nodes, is just making masks. But let's make our stripes. So first approach you might think about is, okay, I want to make a stripe here and here along the cone. Well, we can actually define those regions by how tall they are. So if we were to take a geometry node, look at the position, this just outputs a vector for each point. At each point, it looks at what its position is, and then it colors it accordingly. If we were to separate by x, y, z, and look at the z component, or the z-axis, which goes, up. As it goes up on the z-axis, it gets brighter. You might think that this is an approach to do it because that defines different heights on the cone. In fact, if we were to do something like I guess we could just go directly to a color ramp node. We set this to constant. You can see we're already defining what this is going to look like, right? We can just slide across the cone. This is one approach, but there is a major issue with this, and that is, remember, we made all these parameters that we want to be able to control our cone with. One of them is cone height. And if we were to change how tall this thing is, the stripe doesn't really move with it. It is procedural what we did, but it's not really a smart approach. It's kind of like dependent on a certain size, where we want everything to be independent of each other and just work in unison. So maybe dependent is the word I'm looking for. So we're not going to be using this approach. Instead, we're going to be doing a similar thing to what we did, the other time with the cone, which was, let me disable displacement. It was creating a radial gradient, which uses this length operation using our texture coordinates. We already talked about this. And the nice thing about this is it kind of, in some sense, deforms with our geometry a bit more. And even if not, it's just a nicer way to work. So we're going to be doing something like this. So you might think, oh, we can use this length thing. And in fact, we can't. Why? Well, it's because of the same issue as before, where we now have this height component that's kind of controlled by these parameters. So we need to make it independent of that. So how do we want to do this? Well, a nice way to do this is we're going to separate XYZ and combine XYZ. So we have a node to break our vector and a node to create our vector. So let's take our texture coordinates, put it in here, and let's have a length in here. And then I'm going to connect, let's say, X to X, Y to Y, and Z to Z. Okay, so what have we done here? Well, basically, there is no difference between this chain, right? Just going along here and going along here, because separating and combining and doing nothing in between means nothing happens. So here's what it looks like before, after. It's essentially the same thing. But if we want to make it independent of displacement, in other words, independent of the z-axis, all we have to do is sever this connection. So now it's still calculating the length, but it's calculating two-dimensional length, as if we never actually displaced this upwards. So this is the useful thing. So you can see that when we make our plane have no displacement, these are equivalent, but the moment that we add in displacement, in other words, we add in some variation on z, you can see that now there's actually a pretty big difference. And since this is independent of displacement, we can now make our stripes in a way that kind of works better with the procedural approach. So I'm thinking we do the same approach as before. We're just going to use a color ramp. We're going to set it to constant, so we have these nice sharp fall-offs. And then all we really need to do is kind of define the area of our stripes. Okay, so I'm thinking we start off with like a stripe here, which means that we should bring down the Y. I always get these mixed up. I guess you could do it either way. You could bring this, I guess you can't do it either way. You do need to bring this down. So I'm going to keep bringing it down until we're at the top area of our stripe. So I'm just going to pick something like that maybe. But of course we don't want, imagine the white area is our stripe. We don't want this entire thing to be the stripe. So we just click add, which will add another black handle. And then we just bring it to the other side, which will give us the thickness or the width or the size of our stripe. So we're just going to be able to control that. And then let's click plus again, which will give us a white handle. We bring it to the other side. And this is how we make our second stripe. You can just continue, and you can make as many stripes as you want using this method. But you can see how this idea of using a color ramp is actually fairly similar to the idea of using a RGB curves, where it is procedural. We do have complete control, but it's not in the sense of like value nodes. Like we need to manipulate this node itself and pull the handles. There's a way to do it like nice and mathematically with the value nodes and the math nodes. We're not going to do that. This is like the fastest approach to do it. So I'm just going to be pulling around these until I'm happy with the positioning of our stripes. Something like this maybe. And again, like we talked about, and this is the key idea of part 3 of procedural, it's independent of displacement. So let's make this a mask. Let's just for now use it as our diffuse PSDF color, meaning it's going to inherit this as the color, so it's going to be black wherever there isn't stripes, white where there is stripes. If we were to now disable displacement, you can see this is what it looks like because it's independent of Z. It's just kind of like projected down to the XY plane. With displacement, and the key idea is as we bring down our scale, meaning the strength of our displacement, you can see that these stripes kind of move with the cone, right? That's the key idea here. And if we were to manipulate our cone height, you can see that these stripes stretch with it. Of course, they become longer because that's the only way to do it, where they maintain the same like ratio of height up the cone. Hopefully all this makes sense. Again, key idea, these stripes move with the cone, whereas the approach with the just this length without the getting rid of the Z component doesn't do that. Okay, so now we've isolated our stripes, and I'm thinking for now, just to make it look a bit nicer, we can take this color ramp, which basically outputs either black or white exactly, because we set it to constant. There is no fall off like there is with ease, right? It's just like that. What we can do is we can use this with a mix RGB node. So it's going to process through this before it gets to color. We're going to use this as the factor. And we can say that the color 1 should be white, I believe. No. Color 1 should be orange. So this is the color of our cone. And color 2 should be, white. And basically you can pick whatever you want for this. So I'm just going to use some colors for now. We can change these later just so we can see what we're working with. And now what I want to do is make these stripes a bit more interesting. Yes, they follow our, geometry. Yes, they're in the correct position, but in some sense, they're like too perfect. And if you look at real cones, there's a bit of distortion. It's not like a perfect line. So I'm going to tell you how to do that because it's a nice trick. So if you're thinking about how do I kind of distort these stripes, well, we can either like mess around with color ramps and do some complicated math. That seems like a lot of work. What if instead we do it before we reach this step? We actually manipulate the texture coordinates to begin with. We manipulate these, and then as it goes through, it just propagates that change to make the distorted stripes. That would make a lot more sense. And in general, messing with texture coordinates is a much smarter approach than messing with, whatever happens afterwards. So we're going to stick with the purple socket area. So here's the trick. What we're going to do is we're going to add in a noise texture. Again, this is procedural. And what we're going to do is we are going to not enable caps lock. We're going to do a vector math node and add these together. You can use factor or color. There's a bit of a difference, but I don't think we're going to go into it in this tutorial. What this is going to do, you can see what this is doing is it's, distorting our texture coordinates, meaning it's making our stripes like heavily, in the wrong place, but they are wavy. And the idea is we took our texture coordinates and we added just a bit of randomness or noise texture, whatever you want to call this. And we can actually control this to get different like weird stuff happening to our stripes. Okay, so it's kind of the right idea, but our stripes have now moved far away from where they're supposed to be. Why? Here's the key idea of this part. Noise texture, what it does if we view it, is it gives every point on our cone a value between 0 and 1. There's an algorithm to choose what that is, but that's what a noise texture does. Every point gets some value between 0 and 1 that's effectively kind of random to us. That means on average, if you do this over infinitely many points, on average, we're adding 0.5, because if it's between 0 and 1, some values are going to be small, some of them are going to be big, and overall, if it's a uniform distribution, on average, you're adding 0.5, so halfway in between, on X, Y, and Z. So in every axis, you're on average adding 0.5. That means that when we look at this addition, and let's actually view the whole thing, that means that on average, the whole thing is shifted by the vector 0.5, 0.5, 0.5. And you already know about like translation and all this because we've been using, not in this group node, but in this one, we've been using like the add vector math all the time just to shift our coordinates, right? So this is what's happening. It's shifting our coordinate system by 0.5, 0.5, 0.5 on average. So to correct for this, what do? Well, if you want to get rid of that 0.5, 0.5, 0.5, you add or subtract, but we're going to go with add negative 0.5 on x, y, z. Boom. Now you can see our stripes are somewhat in the right place, and in fact they are. But even if we distort this, they kind of stay centered on that area. So we're closer to what we want. We're not really there, but we're closer. And this little node group right here, this kind of texture coordinates, add noise, you add noise, and then you add this correction term, which shifts everything back. This is a famous trick in Blender for blurring. It's fake, but fake blurring textures. So if we were to make the scale something like 1,000, effectively what this does is it takes our two stripes and just blurs them. That's the idea. And it only works when you pick a very large number for the scale. This is close to what we want, but really what we need is to have more fine control and just distort the border, not this entire thing to blur. We don't want this. So in other words, we kind of want to control the strength of this effect. So if you're following so far, good, because this is a complicated idea. If we want to control the strength of this effect, let me try duplicating that again. What I'm going to do is before this reaches the addition, so before we include this to our texture coordinates, let's affect the strength of it. So I'm going to put it through a vector math node set to scale. In other words, this number, this scale value is going to be the strength of our noise. And let's plug that in here. So this time it's being processed through a scale. And right now it's set to 1, which means that nothing has changed. We're multiplying by 1. Nothing's different. But if we were to change this value, you can see that different stuff happens. And we're getting the same issue with shifting. Right now it's going up the cone. And the reason is, again, we do have our correction term, but that is dependent on what we do to our noise. Before it was going from 0 to 1. So on average, we have to shift back by negative 0.5 on x, y, z. If we were to make this a different value, then our correction term also changes. So that means we need another scale node. We're going to plug that in here. We're going to use minus 0.5. That's our correction vector, and then scale it by the same amount. So let's add a value node. Plug it in here. So this is the strength of our noise, and this is the strength of our correction term. If our noise is half as strong, 0.5, our correction term only needs to be half as strong. It doesn't need to overshoot. And now you can see that we can drag this slider. Everything stays centered. And if we get pretty close to 0, you can see that we keep our distortion, but everything stays centered because our correction term is correct. And we actually have even more control over this because we can still affect the size of our noise. So if we were to make this like 50, everything stays in the right place. It's just, more distorted. We could add detail to add like a bunch of sharp edges and all this. And that's the main idea. So what I'm going to do is, since we have another value node, I'm going to add it to our collection of parameters. This one we can call, what is it? It's essentially a stripe distortion. Maybe we can just call it stripe, since we're not using any other parameters for our stripes, I don't think. Again, you can mess with this color ramp so that, maybe we should add one more parameter. Like, for example, what we can do is we could do a math add, and you can think of this as just shifting. So if we were to make this a bit bigger than 0, we're shifting it up and down the cone, and it actually will stick regardless of displacement for the same reason as before. So let's actually add that in. So this one I'm going to set to 0 by default. We can call this one stripe. And by default, it's using 001 because we already named something stripe. And for this one, we can call stripe distortion. So we have like pretty much a parameter for everything we could ever want right here. So stripe, how translated do you want it? Stripe distortion, how distorted do you want it? And again, there is a purpose for this. It's kind of like, when you look at cones, they are a tiny bit distorted. I swear the lines aren't straight. But even if they are, this is a valuable lesson to learn. So I'm going to keep this very subtle. Something like 0.02, see what that looks like? That looks interesting. It's much better than a straight line, maybe 0.01. Just so there's a tiny, tiny bit of variation. Okay, so now essentially what we've done is we've created our mask that we can distort, we can shift, and just to keep it interesting, again, this is what it looks like without displacement because, again, we're just kind of projecting to the XY plane since we made it independent. There is no Z. We made it independent of Z. But we can actually visualize what all the nodes we've added do. So stripe is going to shift it up and down, which means it's going to make it bigger and smaller. Bigger and smaller. So let's see that. Whoops, made it too big. Let's try that again. So you can see now these are just kind of shrinking, but the ratio of like width stays the same. So that's the idea there. And then stripe distortion will just kind of distort it on this plane and then bring it up with displacement is the idea. Okay, so now let's visualize this whole thing. And, and I like how it actually keeps that transparent boundary that we made. Let's look at this again. There we go. And something that might be interesting just before we wrap up part 3 is I'm going to add one more parameter for the strength of our displacement. So I'm just going to call this one displacement. And this is something we generally want to keep between 0 and 1 because we've already done all our scaling and everything before we reach the height of the displacement node. So no need to do it within there. So what this does is it lets us actually flatten our displacement and visualize what happens as we create our cone. And I do like the idea of also having this affect the color. So let's also do another mix RGB before it reaches our diffuse BSDF. This will be the first color. White will be our second color. And our factor, whoops, will be our displacement, if I can even see that. Such a small thing. And I guess we should have these flipped, it looks like. I think. Let's see. I think I flipped the wrong ones. This should be here. Okay, so what does this mean? This means that when it's 1, we have pretty much what we made, but as we go to 0, it will flatten and turn white. I guess it's not really doing that because we have the wrong color. So let's make that saturation 0. Okay, so again, this is just a cool way to visualize. It's in the tutorial intro as well. In the beginning, you saw this animation. Okay. And then we also want this to affect the transparency. So we want there to be no transparency when it's at no displacement. And I didn't really think ahead. So let's just try things and see what works. So let's try something like that. Maybe a subtract and clamp. Nope. That is absolutely not doing it. You know what? I can think about this later. It's not that important. It's obvious, but when you're on the spot making a tutorial, let me tell you, it gets complicated. So now we have a nice, maybe displacement isn't a good way to describe it. Maybe transition is a better way because we're also affecting color. So now we can also, do that thing. So there you go. That's that's how you add stripes. I guess it's a good idea to somewhat clean up this mess. You know what I say? Whenever there's too much going on, just throw it in a node group. So that's what we're going to do. We just want to make sure all our parameters are exposed so we can control them outside of the group again. It is a shame that the color ramp node has to go inside the group, but oh well. So let's just get all of that. Control G to put it in a group. Right there. And let's clean it up just a bit. Cool. So now we have all our parameters going into the stripe mask. Let me get rid of that. Actually, I guess this isn't it is the stripe mask. We have that. We have the, this thing, the cone mask, rounded square, margin square. You can clean it up on your own time. This is just a demo. But yeah, okay, so we've made this much more procedural. We've added in the last mask we need, and then the rest of this tutorial, which is not this one, but the next one, part 4, we're going to be talking about how to make this just look a bit better. So yes, we could like reshape our cone using some of these parameters. Like for example, I feel like our cone isn't quite tall enough, so we can make our base height like 0.15, just to make it a bit taller. We could do stuff like that, but I want to talk about how to make it reflective in the right areas, how to add dirt, using ambient occlusion, stuff like this. But yeah, there you go, part 3 of PRO-CEDURAL. Thank you for watching. Okay, so we're at the end of the tutorial, which means it's time for the Patreon pitch. Don't leave yet. I do have something to say. If you like these tutorials and want to support me making tutorials, and more importantly, maybe get certain benefits like exclusive tutorials, Discord access, behind the scenes access, tutorial files, stuff like this, do check out the Patreon. This is the best way to keep this channel going. It's actually the most reliable revenue stream in all this. Patreon is where you want to go if you like everything I do and you want to get some behind the scenes and all this. And I feel like I forgot the rest of my pitch. That's generally the idea. But either way, I hope you enjoyed this free tutorial, and let's move on to part 4 when I release it. Okay, so I'm in this weird position where I just woke up, so I have this voice that's like 10 times deeper than it usually is. I imagine that as we progress through part 4, and this is the finale of Video Cone, my voice is gonna go back to its normal thing, but for now, just enjoy. So, where did we leave off? By the way, if I keep looking to the side, dual monitor setup now, we're rising up. Okay, so where did we leave off? Well, we had this node network that I cleaned up just a bit because this was looking like a war zone or something. Even, I mean, these node groups are a bit cleaner, I guess, inside. Oh, never mind. This is a disaster all the way through. But we left off with, I think we have all the geometry of the cone and all the masks that we need. Namely, we have our stripe mask. We have our, what's this? It's probably our cone mask, which you can see without a displacement. So we have our, our cone mask and that punch-in mask, which some people said you could do with the RGB curves, and you'd be right. But this gives us more control outside of that RGB curves node, so that's why I did it. And also because I just didn't think of it. Here's our rounded square and the one with the margin. Okay, we've gone over this 1,000 times. And then we just, I do like seeing it flattened. And then we just kind of colored it a bit and called it done. So you might be thinking, what is part 4 for? I mean, we have the whole shape of it. You know what? What's left to do? What's left to do is just to make this look just a bit more realistic. I'm not going to really take it all the way there, but if this is our starting point and this is a 0, I can take us up to like a 6 out of 10 on realism. So step 1 is this diffuse BSDF, more like diffuse BSD garbage. We don't want it. Instead, we're going to be using a principled BSDF node, which is kind of like diffuse BSDF on like millions of steroids, right? It's just better in every way. And so, I mean, it takes longer to calculate, I imagine. But we're just going to connect this to the base color and this to our mix shader. So effectively, we've just replaced our diffuse with a principled BSDF, which gives us a lot more control, which is a good thing, but it also means we need to do a lot more work. So first of all, you see this thing is super, super shiny, and that might be good depending on what you want your cone to look like, but that is determined by the roughness. How rough is your surface? So at 0, it's kind of reflective, almost like a mirror. You can see our HDRI if you look kind of closely. And then at 1, very diffuse. And that's what the diffuse BSDF generally looks like. So instead of just picking a number for this, I want to have different roughnesses for different areas. Namely, I want a roughness of, let's say, I don't know, 0.7, 0.8, wherever we have our main cone, and then a roughness that's a bit higher wherever we have our stripes, because I want those to be worn out a bit. Or maybe I want the opposite, I don't know. So to control this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add in a color ramp. No, dude, my voice is booming today. It's booming. And this is going to let us control both the black areas and the white areas. So with the black areas of the cone, we just select a color, and you see we'll only affect that area. I'm going to go with something like, we could just put it in here. Let's do 0.75. And then for the white areas, I think I want the worn out look, meaning a very large roughness, closer to 1. So I think I'm just going to keep it at 1. You could also do the reverse, where you want those stripes nice and reflective. So I take this, plug it into roughness, and view. Okay, so now we have this. It's still a bit shiny, but we can't like really see reflections or anything. And notice that those stripes aren't like shiny at all. Okay, so that is a good start. I'm thinking also the color is a bit off, but it really depends on the kind of cone you're going for. Like in one of my animations, I did go from like a reddish cone to an orange cone. It's hard to tell what's right. Maybe it's a bit too punchy with the saturation, so like something like 0.9 would be good. But now it's looking a bit too, it's really personal preference. Okay, we can always change that later. So now we have our base color determined, we have our roughness determined, and there's a bunch of more, parameters that we can mess with. Most of them aren't actually relevant, like subsurface. Light's not really leaking through our cone. I guess it does have a bit of a subsurface property, in fact, but we're not going to mess with it. It's not metallic, it's specular you can mess with to get interesting results, and then most of these are just not relevant in any capacity, unless you want your cone to have a clear coat, like it's freshly shined, which will give it that super shiny effect. So, since there's not much we can mess with here, what I do want to add is maybe some dirt, wear and tear, and we can do that for the color, so some of it's going to be brown and gross and grungy. And we can do a bit of that on the normal map, so it actually has some changes in like lighting interaction. So, I'm thinking, let's do the dirt. So I'm going to mix this again, so it's going through 3 mix nodes. The first one's to determine, the color of the cone and the stripes. This one's going to be our dirt, and this one was just for the transition slider we made before. That again flattens everything, shows us where it actually came from, which is cool. So we're not going to mess with that one, but we are going to mess with this one, and we want there to be some like dark brown or something like this. And we'll take that factor all the way up. So right now it's not really mixing in a nice way because it's averaging them everywhere, right? We're not saying put dirt here and not here. It's just everywhere. And that's what it would look like. So let's view the entire thing. So that actually looks pretty cool. Kind of like a metal, I don't know, hard surface cone. Either way, yeah, that looks super cool. Either way, what we're going to do is we're going to add a noise texture to define where we want dirt and not dirt, so we can plug that into the factor. And already you see that it doesn't look as bad, but the dirt is super, super subtle. And one thing to kind of wrap your head around is in this mix node, the dirt, being this like brownish black stuff, is in the second socket, meaning it's in the foreground, meaning it's going to show up wherever the factor is closer to 1, wherever it's closer to white. Okay? So keep that in mind. What we're going to do is we're going to add in a color ramp node. We're just going to add a bit of contrast here. A bit of contrast. And maybe I'm going to bring this up, bring this down, just so there isn't such a large gradient from one to the other. By the way, this isn't even connected. There we go. Now you can see. Now we can actually see splotches of dirt. And if you wanted it to be more, bit more of a fall off, you could just bring these handles further apart. But now we can actually see our dirt, and our dirt looks like trash, so let's make it look better. First of all, I like dirt with a good amount of detail. You might want a mud look, in which case you keep something like this, but if you want dirt that has like, you can see the individual grains, detail, maximum value, which is 16, and roughness will also change the way it looks, so this will be very muddy, and this will be very fine and detailed when you bring it close to 1. So you just want to decide what the quality of your dirt is going to look like. For me, that's this. And then finally, you can decide on the scale of your dirt. So make sure if your scale's too small, you're not going to see any features. But in some sense, it does look a bit more realistic, because as you go upwards, you're going to see like too many splotches going on. Like here, there's quite a bit going on. So maybe like 6. I don't know. We can always play with this later. Completely procedural. And we can make a nice parameter for this. Okay. So now we have our dirt, and it's showing up in some areas and not in others, and it already looks a bit better, but you know what, I was going to say let's make a better mask for this, and we will, but first, I guess, let's play a bit more with the lighting interactions with this dirt. So, one thing I'm thinking is wherever there's dirt, this should have a roughness of very close to 1, right? Wherever there's dirt, it should not be shiny, because, you put this layer of dirt over it, you understand. So, remember, we made this whole setup that goes into our roughness, where something closer to 1 is more rough, less shiny. So what we can do is remember, our dirt is wherever it's closer to 1, if we set this up correctly, which means what we can do, roughly, get it, is we can add this color ramp. which will add nothing wherever there isn't dirt, meaning it won't change the roughness, and wherever there is dirt, it will add some, making it a bit rougher. At least that's what it should look like. Yes, and already you can see that some of this like reflection is broken up by the dirt, giving it some surface imperfections, giving it some nice detail. And all of this works whenever we change our noise. It all just works together. Okay, so I'm thinking, how do we improve this mask? Well, where does dirt accumulate naturally? Well, think about it. Where do you need to, when you're showering, where do you need to clean? Your armpits? Also in between your fingers, all this. I don't know if you're in the shower going like this. But basically what I'm saying is dirt accumulates in creases, which makes sense. I guess in some sense, if you have a big flat table, it accumulates on the surface because, that's where it would fall. But generally, it accumulates in creases because otherwise it'd fall off your body. So we can do the same thing with the cone. We want a lot of dirt along this crease, definitely a lot here. Imagine how much dirt would be captured, maybe some near the floor. And there's a way to do this. You could either go with the naive approach, which actually is, it's not that naive. You use the geometry node, look for pointiness, which will, and it's hard to tell because pointiness, it doesn't give you a nice black and white 0 or 1 mask. You have to use a color ramp to actually see the variation here, but pointiness shows where our model is pointy, which is kind of like a crease, but it also includes like corners and stuff like this that are pointing outwards. So this is one approach. What I like, and since we're using cycles, what we're going to be using is ambient occlusion. Ambient occlusion, what does that mean? Well, remember, ambient occlusion is basically where an object is like self-shadowing. Where does an object cast shadows on itself? Well, definitely wherever there's creases, like my fingers are making so many shadows here, you wouldn't believe. My armpit would have a shadow because, my shoulder's obstructing light and all this. Ambient occlusion, it looks like this, and you can kind of tell it's generally white, but a bit darker along the creases. And again, notice that it looks super broken on our base, and again, this kind of thing is solved with more subdivisions. Or you could do a nice fall off for the base. Somebody sent me a blend file where they did this. I might share, but it was a good tip. We're not doing that for this one. But it's accumulating wherever we have these creases, and as we make our subdivisions, more dense, it will be less of an issue. It's good, but we could use a bit more oomph. It's not dark enough where it should be, so I'm going to add in a math node. And you might think, oh, he's going to set it to multiply, pick a big number. It kind of works, but really this is kind of like upping the contrast. It's not what we want. So instead, I can't remember if I showed you this trick, but using power is a much, much better kind of way to go because ambient occlusion will output a black and white mask 0 to 1, 1 where there isn't ambient occlusion, 0 where there is. Power, what it does is if you go to small numbers like, 0.5 for square root and all this, will give us a certain kind of distribution, which isn't what we want, but the other kind, x squared, x cubed, x to the power of 4, will give us a nice sharpness. So let me show you what I mean. So this is 1, nothing has changed. X squared, power of 2, you can see it's starting to work. Cubed, quartic, quintic, now you're really seeing what it's doing. It's really like preserving, the differences, but it's giving us a nice, I don't want to say contrast because that's what we said before. It's kind of more like gamma in some sense, but you can see it's really darkening those areas with a nice fall off. So this area which we said would have a ton of dirt does, and same with the base over here has a ton, while the main part of the cone not so much. So this is what we want, and we can always change this value later. So again, remember, we want dirt wherever it's white, and if we were to multiply this, with these two together, so include our ambient occlusion, it's almost what we want, but not really, because we're saying keep our mask, keep our dirt wherever there's a crease, but right now it's black, so we want to invert this. So it's white, meaning preserve this dirt at the creases. So you could either try, and I've had issues with this in the past, an invert node, which will invert, right? But I'm going to go with the mathematically stable version, and let me show you how to do that. So let's clamp that. Here's what I'm going to do. So right now we have an interval of 0 to 1, and we want to reverse it 1 to 0. This will flip it. The way you do this is if you have 0 to 1, what you can do is multiply by -1. So 0 to 1 becomes -1 to 0. So think about it. Largest value is 1. That gets sent to -1. Smallest value is 0. That stays the same. So the interval flips -1 to 0. And now we just need to shift that up to 0 to 1, which you can do by adding by adding 1. Now, ideally, this does the same thing as the invert node, but let me tell you, I've had issues with it. So here's what we're gonna, keep. And now that we can actually see what's going on, so white is where we want, our dirt, we can change this exponent to really, pick what we want to happen here. And you can still do the multiply approach, but okay. So we have this. White is where we want dirt. White is where we want dirt. And then we just multiply these together. So it needs to intersect and at the same time. Boom. So now we have our dirt, but only in, those areas. So what do? We plug this in to our factor for where we want the dirt color, and we also need to do the same thing for the roughness, because it's not truly this where we have dirt, but where we have our final multiplication. So like this. What does that look like? Okay. It's a bit subtle, but you can see that now there's no dirt on this surface, and it's still behaving the same. It's still working correctly. Okay. Now, you might be thinking, okay, we've done it, but the dirt's not very visible, and you'd be right, and this is an easy fix. So what are we going to do? Well, before we send our dirt mask out to, work on our color, work on our roughness and all this, what we can do is multiply. And I only want to multiply on the color because I'm happy with, how it's interacting with roughness. So I'm just going to multiply on this chain and use something like 5. That's a bit much. 3. And you know what? You know what I'm thinking? Let the user decide. Make that another parameter. Let's call this dirt. Even though we have many more ways to control the dirt, like the power from before, for now we'll call this one dirt. And we'll put that there. So 0 means no dirt. 4 means a lot of dirt. 40 means mucho dirt. Okay. I'm thinking something like 4, I don't know. And then another thing we can do is if you're thinking, oh, yeah, I like the ambient occlusion, I like the idea, but it's kind of exposing, or this area is kind of exposed to no dirt. You want there to be at least a bit of dirt in that area, but still maintain most of it at the base and at the tip. What you can do is right now this ambient occlusion setup is really just saying keep it here but not here. So what you can do is do another addition, and this will add everywhere. This will add everywhere. You could add some value. So 0.5 will make it, have a bit of dirt everywhere. 0.1, just a tiny bit of dirt. I'm thinking this should also be an exposed parameter. And we'll call this is the type of thing people usually call mid-level for a, complicated, not that complicated reason. Just think about it as this isn't really giving us that much info about the dirt, but it's saying what should be the base level. So maybe dirt base would be a better name for this, but that's fine. Okay, so let's view. So when our dirt base is a large value, you can see kind of goes a bit too hard. 0, same thing as before. Let's try like a 0.2. Yeah, so now we have the subtle dirt creeping up. It's not too much, and we can make our dirt less intense with color. I'm thinking that right now we have too much oomph going on. Let's bring down our exponent, because again, this is what controls that quality. And you're going to notice that there's some weird stretching going on at the base. This is unavoidable unless, again, you make some fall off with the rounded square. But for now, we will live with it. You can always play with this later and also change the color of the dirt. But we can now have dirt and be happy about it. Okay, so now how do we take it to the next level? We have our color interaction. We have our roughness interaction. Do we have normal interaction? No. So let's add a bump node. This will convert height maps into normal maps, essentially. And we want bump wherever there's dirt, right? We want there to be a bit of elevation wherever there's dirt, fine. And maybe we also want a bit of elevation on the stripes. So they're not really like part of the cone, but they're painted on, and there's this thin layer of paint that's a bit higher than the cone. Okay, let's do that. So first of all, how do we make dirt? How do we do this with dirt? Well, first of all, let's see. I already forgot which of these we want. So this one is the one that doesn't have ambient occlusion factor. Or no, it does because of our addition. It's kind of subtle. And then this one's the one we manipulated. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to plug in this one. Can't even see what I'm doing. We're going to plug it in here and then just convert it to height since we put it in the wrong socket. Let's see what that looks like. you're going to notice there's definitely some normals going on here. I'm just going to let it render a bit. But it's a bit too intense. It kind of looks like the cone is made out of like tree bark or something, because there's a very thin layer of dirt. A very thin layer of dirt, like almost everywhere. So there's going to be that like normal stuff everywhere. So what I'm going to do is I'm also going to use this for the strength, which should make it a bit better. Yes, you can already see now our reflections are popping. So before, no reflections at all, because and this isn't roughness. This is literally making our surface rough or deforming it kind of in the normal sense, right? But when you include in strength, it kind of takes care of most of this. So we do still have a good amount of bump wherever there's dirt, but not so much where it's very, subtle. Okay, awesome. Now let's also include our stripe mask, which is already conveniently white where there is stripes. So that's saying there's height where there is stripes and there isn't height otherwise. So all we need to do is a bit of math. Addition for, I'm going to do only the height. I'm not going to have this one manipulate strength or anything. And we just plug this in here. So now it's adding these two. So now you can see this is included. So there's definitely going to be quite a bit of height there. And let's clean this up and visualize. Boom. This is a very dirty cone. Let me get me on the main screen. A very dirty cone. I love this dual monitor setup. Okay, cool. So let's do some final touches. I'm thinking color is still a bit off. I don't know why. Just feels wrong. I feel like this traditional orangey cone color maybe fits a bit better. Somewhere in between like that. Cool. And you might be thinking, okay, this is a pretty realistic cone. Could be better. Well, let me remind you, in case you have forgotten, that this is a plane. So we're doing pretty well considering that this isn't an actual cone. I'm thinking these stripes are a bit off. We could change the stripe color. Again, we determined our stripe versus cone color in this node. So we can make those darker, brighter, maybe even make them a tiny bit yellow. Tiny bit yellow. I like the look of that. And now something I want to do, this is just because I like doing it. This isn't actually necessary for the cone. So remember, our transition slider controlled this node right here. This is the final color change. That will make everything white if our transition is set to 0, 1, something like that. And it's also affecting our displacement. As you can see, it's feeding into the strength. I wanted to be able to do that thing where, we're transitioning between a plane and a cone. But you can see it's not really doing it very well because it doesn't really handle this transparency. And you can see all this dirt and stuff we've just added is still incorporated on this plane. And I think this is because of roughness, right? It worked with the diffuse, but because we're using a principled BSDF, it doesn't do it anymore. So let's actually take care of that. So we don't need this. We'll just have this feed directly in. So this is what it looks like. Let's make our value 1 again. So it should look the same, our cone right now. Should look the same. But we wanted to have a final choice of flattening it. So what we're going to do is at the very end, we've done all of this. We've done our parameters, feed into masks, feed into, color-related stuff, feed into BSDFs. After all this, we're going to add in a mix shader. We're going to mix this with a diffuse BSDF. So notice now, once we do this, no transparency or anything. Once we set factor to 1, because that's after the fact. So our transparency is like back here in this mix shader. After that, mix, right? So before, after, gets rid of the transparency. So we want this, and we'll plug this in as the factor. We might need to invert it. Need to think about that. And it's already connected to displacement, so we're there. And instead of inverting, I believe if we just flip these, that should do it. So let's see what we get. Let's see what we get. I'm doing a save. Here we go, boys. So when transition is 1, meaning 100%, have the cone. When it's 0, have the plane. Why is this working? Well, because it's controlling both displacement and the final BSDF result. So here's what it looks like. So now you can see this. I'm sorry that it's super laggy. It's because I'm recording and have cycles at the same time. So we'll do it in steps. So 0.2, you can see the cone starting to rise. There's a bit of roughness interaction. 0.4, the plane's becoming a bit transparent. 0.6, now we're really starting to get a bit of color. 0.8, And I guess the color does show up pretty late into the process, and I guess that's just how stuff is mixed together. So if you want more control over this, you could, I've lost my nodes. If you want more control over this, you can do it back into color level before the BSDF level, but I do like the way this looks. I love adding a transition slider, just being like, oh, you thought it was like an average looking cone? Yeah, it's all right. No, it's a plane. So there you go. I think we've taken care of everything we would want. So again, we replaced our diffuse for a principled. We're controlling the color, the roughness, the normal. I feel like that's it, really. Well, what you could do is you could, I mean, actually you can't. What I was going to say is you could use this dirt to add a bit of displacement, right? Displacement instead of bump. But what you have to realize is our displacement is calculated first to deform the geometry, and then we did the dirt stuff, right? Because this noise would not wrap around this mesh like this until displacement was enabled. So there's kind of like an order of operations. My voice, I feel like, maintained its boominess throughout the whole thing. So there you go. I've now showed you how to make a cone, a cone out of a plane. I don't know why it's useful, but you did learn quite a bit. Remember, we have these parameters for pretty much everything. A bit of a highlight reel. We have our general dirt, basically saying, you know, what about the general area that isn't super high on ambient occlusion? We have our dirt, which is kind of just controlling the color. We have our stripe, which is the distortion, I believe, unless it's something else. Oh no, this is the stripe offset. So where do you want it on the cone? We have our stripe distortion, which is distortion. We have our cone height, which again plays nicely with everything. This is the awesome thing about it. We can now make any kind of cone that can be made out of these parameters. We have our roundness, which will break the cone if you set it to values that don't work. So you can make it a sharp cone, round cone, side length, thick cone, base height, tall cone. Now you can really see stuff starting to break. Punch in is the whole depth, and margin is just for like rendering stuff. So we have all these parameters, and the nice thing about this is since it's all working with these texture coordinates, I believe, unless I've forgotten something, I believe what we should be able to do is literally just move our cone along the plane. So you can see what's happening here. We're just shifting our cone along the plane. We could also rotate the cone. So this is kind of like, whoops, I wanted a vector rotate node. This is kind of just like moving your object once you've modeled it. Yeah, so we're rotating our cone. You could really use it like a three-dimensional object. And in fact, since we made this, you can make a ton of cones on a single plane, all this. But there you go. I think this is pretty good. I'm going to make this project file available to all the patrons above. I think it's $5 gives you the project files. And I'll also probably give the cone I made originally because there might be some variations. This one might even be better than the one I made originally because I could talk it out and everything. But yeah, let me put me on the main screen. There you go. PRO-CEDURAL, what a wave. Part 1, Part 2, Part 3, Part 4, you learned how to make everything. And I might do more advanced shader node tutorials if people are into it. And I like the idea, so we'll do ideas more interesting than cones. Maybe we'll look into vector displacement. I don't know. But yeah.